You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to episode number 213 of the Just Japan podcast, everything you want to know about Japan. My name is Kevin O'Shea. I'm a Canadian currently living in Asia. At the moment, I'm based in Penang, Malaysia. Been in Asia for 22 years. South Korea, Japan, China, Malaysia. Hey, we're back with a new episode, a fantastic episode. It's all about seeing Japan by foot, on foot, I should say. Not really by foot. Our feet don't have eyes, do they? Seeing Japan on foot. Seeing Japan in a slower way than many people actually do. And in this episode, I chat with a good friend of mine, Kevin Tarpey. And he is an American expat living in Shimane Prefecture. And you don't hear too many people who are living and based in Shimane Prefecture. And it's really fantastic to talk to Kevin. This is an interview I did last year for the Just Asia podcast, which I have now shelved, and I'm focusing all of my energy here back on the Just Japan podcast. And Kevin has been a friend of mine since back in 2002, where we first met when we were both working and teaching in South Korea. We were both in the kind of bedroom community of Seoul called Ilsan in Goyangsi in Gyeonggi province. And he's a fantastic friend. And I later left and went to Japan. Of course, I married a Japanese woman and worked at international schools in Japan for some 10 years. And he, a few years after I came to Japan, he came to Japan to a different part, following a different career path. And now he is happily living the quiet life. He's married, living in the kind of Inaka, and he's a fantastic individual. He has a great Instagram feed over at The Green Hoof. The Green Hoof. There'll be a link below. You got to follow it. He has the most amazing photos. And you'll really see, what I love about Kevin so much is that he is so connected with the outdoors and nature and hiking and climbing. And he's not an influencer. He's not that kind of person, a social media influencer. He's not someone who's trying to get famous. He's just someone who truly loves being outdoors. And that really comes through in his Instagram. And also he writes an article for a local newspaper in Shimane Prefecture all about his walking, which is really cool. So, before we get into that interview, a couple of things I want to share. Of course, we do have a Patreon campaign happening now. There are two tiers, Ninjas and Samurais, $5, $10. If you join and become a patron, you can listen to the bonus podcast. It comes out 2 to 3 times a month, the Spicy Wasabi podcast. Also, you can get video versions of the podcast where you can see our faces and our conversations, less edited as we conduct these different interviews. So that's really cool. So go check that out. The link is below, and it's over at patreon.com/justjapanpodcast97. Links are below in the show notes. What else do I want to mention? Welcome to anyone who is new to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming over. For all of you who stayed with the Just Japan podcast feed over the years when we were dormant, thank you for sticking around. And for those of you, I know you're trickling in, those of you who were once upon a time Just Japan podcast listeners, but of course unfollowed when I didn't make episodes for a few years. For those of you who are now slowly learning about it, thank you so much. I'm trying to kind of advertise over on my YouTube channel, over on the Busan Kevin YouTube channel, but like my videos on YouTube are so buried in the YouTube algorithm that I put out a video now and it gets like in the first day like 50 hits or something. Gone are the days when I used to get thousands of views. I'm lucky if anyone sees it. So a lot of people say that even though I'm trying to announce it in the YouTube algorithm, or I'm trying to announce it on YouTube, they're not even seeing my YouTube videos. Over on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/justjapanstuff. That link is below. I post there every day, guys. Lots of photos from my years in Japan, in China, in Malaysia, family photos, videos, all kinds of cool links. I'm very active on the Facebook page, which is just facebook.com/justjapanstuff. And now more and more people, as I'm continuously being really active over there, I've noticed over weeks and months, I think I'm starting to, the Facebook feeds or the Facebook posts are starting to appear in people's algorithms and feeds now, which is good. So that's it, guys. So let's jump into my interview, my conversation with my good friend Kevin Tarpey, a man from Boston who is living in Shimane Prefecture. It's another episode of the podcast, and this week I am very happy to have Kevin Tarpey on the show. And Kevin is someone I've interviewed on other podcasts before, but not this one. So Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to come on Just Asia and share with us your story.
No, thank you for having me again. I always appreciate it.
Cool. So, for those who may not know who you are, and this is a new podcast. So you were in a few episodes of the Just Japan podcast back in the day, and I also had you on 2 episodes of the Supernatural Japan podcast.
Yeah.
Everyone check the links below for those, and I will also share links in the Facebook group, which you should all join. So. I do want to touch on a lot of stuff that you talked about during those podcast episodes, but now it's a few years in the future. And again, new audience, people who don't know your really fascinating story and the neat things you've done. So before we get into that, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and where you're currently based.
Yeah, well, my name's Kevin. I'm a walkaholic. It's been 2 hours since my last walk. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong meeting. So yes, my name is Kevin Tarpey. I'm originally from Boston, grew up on the mean streets of Southie, and now gentrified streets of Southie. I was just back there in spring. I'm a teacher. I've been teaching for over 20 years. I've taught in many different environments, starting in South Korea, English language education. I've taught in the Boston public school system. And now most recently in Japan, where I am based, a little town of Unnan in Shimane Prefecture. And these days I spend most of my free time exploring rural Japan on foot.
This is the cool thing. That's why I wanted Kevin on the podcast, because he's someone who gets out there and really connects with Japan in a different way than a lot. We see a lot of social media content. There's a lot of fantastic content creators, on YouTube, on Instagram, and often what we see is like the bright flashy lights of Osaka, of Tokyo, and those have their place, and those are really cool too.
Yeah,
absolutely. But the side of Japan that you're in, or the piece of Japan where you live, you're really experiencing a different side of life.
For sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, and ironically enough today, speaking of walking in Japan, I was actually watching some old videos of Alan Booth.
Of course. Yeah.
The British travel writer.
Alan. Well, I don't know him, but
yes,
I know
but the famed British travel writer who had been based in Tokyo for 20 years. And then he had written books about what he walked across Japan, and he wrote.
Yeah, that's the book I read. What's it? The Road to Sata?
Yes,
perhaps.
I think so. Yeah. And ironically enough, I still have not read that book, and I really want to get a copy of it. But Alan, so the Roads to Sata, and it was published in 1985. And he died. He was quite young. He was only 46. He passed away of cancer.
Yeah,
like in 1993, he passed away. So quite a long time ago. But I've read kind of a more modern version of that. Will Ferguson, the Canadian humorist, had been a Jet, and he wrote a book that had a couple of different names, but one was Hitching Rides with Buddha.
We have the opposite experience. I've been meaning to read that book.
Okay. That one's really great too. But I hear the Alan Booth one is fantastic, but I've gone to bookshops when I was in Japan in the summertime. I couldn't find it. And it's even, I haven't been able to find. Maybe I'll look online. And see if I can.
I think ebook is what I read.
Probably ebook is the way to go. I now have a device for that I can use that my kids no longer, have monopolized. So, so you're a walker, and that's and you walk Japan, and you discover Japan that way. Now, by the way, folks, I've known Kevin since I want to say 2002 or 2003.
Probably, yeah.
Around that time, we first met in South Korea, and we were both working there as English teachers at the time. And I know that even at that point, you were someone who was active and enjoyed going outside and hiking and things like that. So I mean, that's where as long as I've known you, you've definitely been someone who's been out there walking, exploring the world. So what I'm curious about, you already mentioned that you are a walkaholic. Where did the walkaholism begin?
Well, I think if you ask certain members of my family, they probably tie it to the fact that I don't drive.
Okay.
I've never had a license.
Okay.
So I have many family members and friends back in Boston who that would probably be, they tell you that's the reason I walk so much. What else is he going to do? He can't drive anywhere. It's interesting. I was thinking about this question a couple of months ago, and I don't think I can pinpoint a specific reason or point in time when, something happened. I think it was just a cumulative effect of things. For starters, my father, he was a prolific walker, perhaps another walkaholic. And I can remember a specific memory. One of the first times he took me to Fenway Park to watch a Red Sox game. We came out of the park, and your options to get back where we lived were either take the Green Line or to hop in a taxi. And it's just swamped. Everybody's leaving the park. The train is like packed to the gills. No taxis. And my father just said, "Hey, we'll just walk." Now, granted, Fenway Park to where we lived at the time is probably, if you walk it, Google Maps correct route, it's probably a little over 3 miles.
Okay.
So now to me, that would be a short walk. But I was probably 10 years old at the time. And I still vividly remember what an adventure. Like, and I remember at first I was like, is he nuts? Which is a response I've gotten now so many times in my life. Oh, how far is this? I'm just going to walk. Are you nuts? And it was just, I remember it's the biggest adventure I'd had up until that point in my life. I was walking through neighborhoods and streets I'd only driven by before. And it just that sense of excitement and exploration. I think that's probably the earliest memory of it. And you mentioned earlier how we met in South Korea. That was definitely kind of a catalyst for me in terms of, I had camped when I was younger, a lot of family camping trips, not a hiker by any means, but moving to South Korea, you have these beautiful, jagged mountains just running through the country. That's when I started hiking a lot. My first year I lived in Seoul, and it was such a joy to go around and explore different neighborhoods. And now most recently, it's really the first time I've ever lived in a rural environment. I just love walking out my door. I mean, of course I still like hiking, but sometimes I just walk out the door and I have no idea where I'm going to go. Wherever the whim takes me.
Wow, that's so cool. So, I mean, what is it about now that you're in Japan? You've been in Japan for quite some time now. How many years now has it been, actually? I think you've been in Japan 6 years. Okay.
I believe. Yeah, it is 6. Yeah.
So what is it about Japan and walking that goes so well together?
Well, I think
your piece of Japan for sure.
Several things. The first you got to touch upon is safety. Now, you always got to give a caveat. I'm speaking as a male. And talking about safety. I don't know if a female's experience would be different. But I've personally never felt unsafe at any point walking around Japan, unless we're talking about maybe a wild boar or a bear. But when it comes to humans, I've never felt unsafe. So for starters, safety. And I just think the rural areas specifically of Japan are just conducive to walking. Just beautiful rice fields. And there's, of course, it's a very mountainous country. The landscape, never disappoints me.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's just, I mean, I think I look back at my days living in Japan, and it was really hard for me making the transition of moving from Japan to China in many ways. And a big part of that was in Japan, I would go for walks every night. And that's something that I've done long before I was married. When I was a single guy, I would, before the advent of iPods and listening to podcasts and things, I would always go out for a walk at night, as an adult on my own. And I just always enjoyed that quiet time. It was kind of a time of the day where you see like really different things, people who aren't out in the day are out at night. And I think what I really liked, I lived in Kobe and I could walk across that bridge. I lived on one of the man-made islands in the harbor, Port Island. Right. I walked across that bridge and then I could walk. And I could get this peaceful walk and I could see the ocean and boats in the harbor steaming under the bridge. And then I'd get into like the downtown area. And there was just always, it was very neat and vibrant, but it could be very quiet and peaceful at the same time. So I love that. And then I moved to Beijing, and where I live, there was just nothing to see. And I would go walking, and it was really kind of sad and depressing, but I still continued the walks. And but I had to find different ways to motivate myself. And I think I really became engrossed in podcasts and listening to podcasts. Okay. And the whole point of my walk would be to get out and have some quiet time to listen to a podcast I liked. But you're that consummate walker. And, I think the last time we chatted in podcast form was obviously on the Supernatural Japan podcast.
Right.
And I talked to you over the past, I interviewed you once and then I waited a few months and interviewed you again. I talked to you when you had completed half of the famed 88 temples pilgrimage. And then I talked to you again at the end of it. So I was wondering if you could tell the listeners just a little bit about what is the 88 temples pilgrimage? Where is it? And there's a lot here, but if you could just share your experience with us.
Yeah. So basically, it is a pilgrimage where you visit 88 temples that are connected to some form to an old monk that lived probably about 1,000 years ago named Kukai on the island of Shikoku in Japan. You can do it any number of ways. A lot of old Japanese people join a tour group and a bus drives you around all these temples. Yeah. Some couples like to drive, and visit the temples. In many cases, you can visit a lot of them by public transportation. And then there is a small percentage of us wackos that decide, I'm just going to walk all the way around this island and visit all these temples. I don't even know where to begin. It's just such a multifaceted experience.
Yeah. So, folks, apologies for cutting you off, but for you out there listening, guys, to take a deep dive into this, I'll ask Kevin to go in a little bit more detail, but a deep dive. He did 2 episodes on the Supernatural Japan. Each was about an hour long each, so it's like 2 hours of, and then I'm sure you could have just gone on more and more, but there was so much to talk about. But I'm wondering, so this kind of famed walk, what motivated you to do something like this?
I think when we were living in South Korea, I first heard about it. And I kind of put in the back of my head, that sounds interesting. Walk around a whole island of Japan? What would that be like? And now, of course, since moving here, I learned more about it, the religious aspects of it. One of the best aspects of that experience is osetai. The local people of Shikoku have a long tradition of helping out the pilgrims any way they can. This could be giving you food, giving you a ride somewhere, all kinds of things. One of my personal favorite experiences of that happening to me, I was on one of the longest stretches where there's not a lot of amenities, let's just say. The Cape of Moroto. In fact, I remember passing a vending machine, and you, as someone who has lived in Japan, know how vending machines are pretty much all throughout Japan.
Oh, yeah.
Most,
they are ubiquitous.
Places.
Yeah. And that was actually, and for those of you listening, this is one thing that I used to do when years ago, I don't know if you remember, Kevin, I used to be quite the runner. I used to be a long distance runner when I had knees that worked. But now they're because of that running, they're, a bit creaky. And I can remember what I would do. I'd have I would go out with like a handheld water bottle. And if I'd go on like a long run training for a marathon, I might be out running for 3 or 4 hours. Clearly one bottle is not going to do the trick, but I just put a bunch of coins in like a little kind of running fanny pack because I knew that along the route I could constantly just refill my bottle, stop at vending machines, refill the bottle, take that pet bottle, chuck it in the recycling bin beside it. So they were always everywhere, but maybe not where you were, right?
Well, at the start of the day, I think I was an hour into walking to the tip of the Cape Maroto. And I passed this vending machine. I was like, you know what? I'm going to get a coffee. I've been up for a little while. And in Japanese and English, I think it said, like, this is the last vending machine for 15 kilometers, which is pretty much let you know you're entering no man's land in Japan. If that's the gap you have in vending machines, look out. But anyways, the route, that 15 kilometers, pretty much I was heading south. On your left, you had the ocean. On your right, you had just a steep cliff going up into the hills. And I was walking along, and at one point I could tell a truck was driving behind me, and I hear the brakes, and then it pulls up beside me. I'm like, what's going on? Does this guy think I need help? And the guy hops out of the car and runs over. And he's like, oh, osetai. And there was a plastic bag filled with drinks, rice balls, candy, like all kinds of stuff. Now, the best part is he then drives a little further ahead, finds a turnoff, and turns around. So what that means is he passed me earlier, continued driving to the closest convenience store, which was probably like 10 kilometers back, then turned around and brought me those gifts. Wow. And when I say a truck, this guy was working. It wasn't a small truck. It was like he had some kind of cargo he was delivering.
He wasn't a Sunday driver.
No. So he basically extended his working day to take time to help some goofy red-bearded foreigner walking down the highway on the pilgrimage.
Sporting
and this is just one example of just countless times people just doing things that every time it happened, you're just so touched, every single time.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And while you were on that walking journey, I can remember you telling me, what were some of the kinds of places where you stayed? You stayed in a variety of places, didn't you? I mean, it was
yeah. I mean, there is a whole industry these days because of the numbers. It is increasing in popularity, or it has for probably the last 20, 30 years, of minshuku, or in some cases, maybe not high-end ryokan, traditional inns, but, they cater to the pilgrims and pretty much the walking pilgrims, Okay. There's no discrimination, but you just find you'd show up at a place. Hey, I saw you earlier today, or I saw you a couple of days ago, and we're all a bunch of walking pilgrims. But they also have places that I didn't really take advantage of. Free accommodations. Some of the temples will either offer paid lodgings, and in some cases, limited free lodgings.
Okay.
The reason I never did that, I always felt I'm somebody who I can afford to pay my way. What if there's a young man or woman taking a break from college, or, you know what I mean? And you do run into some pilgrims that are kind of taking that, pilgrimage to the max, where I'm going to not spend money. I'm going to stop and beg for alms type thing. I think that person deserves the free lodging over somebody like me.
Gotcha.
So,
yeah. So, and I wonder, one thing that I wonder now is just coming to my mind. One topic that has kind of popped up in a few interviews I've done recently about post-COVID Japan. Is that right now we're seeing like this over tourism happening, and I was a witness to that firsthand this past summer when I was in Osaka. It was just madness, at least, the area where we were staying. And I remember pre-COVID, before I left Kobe, before I left Japan and moved to China to work, I could see, and this is purely anecdotal, every year, the number of visitors coming to say Kobe, it just increased and increased. It was increasing because I could just see on the weekends when I'd go to Sanomiya downtown, I would see bigger crowds and I would hear more languages instead of, once upon a time, I'd only pretty much exclusively hear Japanese, but all of a sudden I was hearing lots of Chinese and I was hearing English and European languages. And now it's growing. I wonder if that's going to somehow impact that pilgrimage too.
Well, I should say, this is one of the most beautiful things about my particular pilgrimage. I did it the last year of not the lockdown. What would you call it again? When tourists
the border closures. The borders were closed.
There you go. Thank you.
The tourists, no one could come into Japan, right?
Yeah. And I only met during my whole walk. I only met, in terms of pilgrims, 2 other foreigners.
Okay.
Yeah. And I had a couple funny moments where a couple pilgrims would be like, "How did you get here?" I swam from Korea. Don't worry. But other than those, kind of uninformed. But yeah, you're right. And I think this is another reason to go for a walk in rural areas, to get away from Osaka, Tokyo, Kyoto, all those, that's another reason. Of course, if this is your first time coming to Japan, of course, you want to visit those places.
You want to see those kind of bucket list places, right? The iconic landmarks and tourists.
So many of these tourists are repeat tourists.
True.
It's their second, third, fourth. And I think a lot of them, but maybe not enough of them, are coming to the kind of overlooked areas. They're starting to realize, am I really getting a Japanese experience being surrounded by other foreigners at such and such temple?
Yeah, exactly.
Such shrine. I don't know.
When you're doing all of your research and planning your trip by looking at top 10 lists, and that's what's out there. And that's one of the things I'm finding now with, for example, the way the YouTube algorithms work. I'll do a search for a video. I'll search for some of my own YouTube videos because I made like over 1,000 videos in the years I lived in Kobe.
Really?
And I can't find any of that stuff now. It's all buried because it's just all flashy thumbnails that are like top 10 things to do in Kobe, top 10 things to eat in Kobe, top 10. And, and it's always the same thing. And that's what I found about like here. So now I'm living in Penang, Malaysia. And before we moved to Malaysia, I was trying to do a bit of research. And I watched a bunch of travel vlogs. And I just said to my wife eventually, this is all bullshit. I'm watching the same vlog for the 20th time, just done by different people. Just a different person.
Yeah.
And it's like cute, fly up drone shot, play music. And then we're at the same place every time. It's just like, okay. And then, now I'm here. And the cool thing is, I work with a lot, the locals at my international school. And these are the people that are like, have you been here? Or have you tried that restaurant? Go to that place. And, the folks who are from here, that's, then you learn the different side of things.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not this bells and whistles type. Look at this. What?
But it's interesting. I know when you first moved to Japan years ago, I can remember you contacting me quite frequently over Facebook Messenger and sending me photos of bugs and flowers and plants, saying, "Kevin, what's this? What's this? What's this?" Because for those who know who I am, I'm an armchair naturalist. I'm someone who loves being outdoors, and I love nature and plants and insects and birds and all creatures great and small. But one thing I've noticed from following your Facebook over the years, and your Instagram is that you now, I would say definitely more than I do about that stuff because in Japan, because you're out there more than I am, and but now this man no longer needs to contact me. He's able to figure this stuff out.
Well, they got apps now, Kevin. No.
Well, I know.
You were my app back in the day.
Now there's iNaturalist, right? Which is what I rely on. And I'm
that's what I use as well. Yeah.
iNaturalist is brilliant. It is brilliant
because of the whole community aspect too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I get a lot of people here, even in Penang, when I put something up that people really readily there to help me to say, now that you misidentified that. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And we love it.
But that's what you want. That's why you use the
do.
app, right? So it's,
exactly. Because sometimes you're like, I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
They'll say, we think it's this. And there's like, you just saw a black ant, and then there's like 10 different kinds of black ants that all kind of look the same and have different names. You're like, I think it's that one.
Yeah.
And then they're like, other people like, and then like 10 people like, no, it's not. It's that one. You're like, okay, I agree. Click.
Yeah. There's 10 of you told me.
There's only
go
me.
With the consensus.
But you definitely do know your stuff a lot more. So, I mean, yeah, I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about that learning curve since you've come to Japan.
Well, walking to me is curiosity in motion. Of course, you might be a walk where you got your headphones on, or like you mentioned before in Beijing, maybe you'd be listening to a podcast. Yeah. But if those headphones are off, you're looking, you're paying attention, and somebody like me, and I know you're similar. What is that?
Yeah.
Not only natural things, anything. You're just curious. You want to know. And when it came to the natural world, bugs, animals, birds, I'm a city kid. I didn't know much. That was part of it. And I don't like posting on social media a picture if I can at least say, hey, this is this kind of bird. This is this kind of bug. And that's probably how it started. Let me just identify it. And then from there, it was, well, now I'm starting to learn more about this bug, this bird. Why don't I add some more information? And it just kind of led me to learn more and more.
Cool.
Basically.
And now you're just sharing like really amazing things. I love watching your posts. I love seeing all the plants and flowers and mountain scenes. You definitely live in a very gorgeous place. It's now you're writing about it. Now you're sharing that with the world. There's my segue. It's a perfect segue. And I shouldn't have said that now because I'm just crushing this illusion. But I mean, which is a really cool thing. You're now writing. You've recently started writing a monthly article for a local newspaper about all of these natural things and about the things that you encounter while walking. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. How did that happen?
Well, the interesting thing about your segue is almost pretty much how it came about. Somebody my wife knows followed my Instagram, really liked my photos, liked the captions, the information I present. And she had been writing for a local newspaper about the 24 seasons. Okay. The old calendar that comes from the Chinese culture that, and she said to my wife, do you think Kevin would be interested? Maybe Kevin could write his articles in English and you could translate to Japanese. And I said, of course I'm interested. But the question is, would the newspaper be interested? Yeah. And they were. I wrote a few samples. My wife translated. And I think first column was in August. Okay. And she'll be doing it for about a year. And their whole idea is our little slice of Japan through a foreigner's eyes. And also, I think knowing my background, write about topics or places that might be overlooked even by locals. Of course, they know of them, but maybe they don't really pay enough attention.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think sometimes like when and it's when you have someone who's exploring through that different lens, right? We see things in a different way. And I think that's like, interestingly enough, like, I think of when I moved to Shenzhen, China for my last job position. I immediately, as I hit my new campus, I hit the ground running, trying to find just what living things were around, what natural things. And I can remember I learned about these fruit bats, this type of fruit bat that was common in southern China. And under palm trees around the campus, there were all these fruit bat colonies, these cute, adorable little bats that would live under all the palm trees. You could just walk up and like look up, and there they were. And then I started showing them to the students, and then teachers are coming over saying, that's amazing. And I had a bunch of teachers who were like, I've been here for 20 years. I had no idea that there's like bat colonies all over the campus. I'm like, well, just look up. I spend a lot of time looking up and looking down and looking under things, So that's that, it's if you're looking at the world in that different way, right? And then again, for someone who was born there, who grew up there, who's been there for generations, certain things maybe are so mundane or typical that you don't even look at them. And then when you're there walking along and saying, well, that's neat. Look at the way they built that shed. Why do they have pieces of wood hanging that way? Or why is the roof that way? Because I've never seen that before in Boston and Southie.
Well, for sure. We don't even have roofs in Southie. No, I'm just kidding.
It's gentrified now, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, no, you should see the roofs they have in Southie these days.
They just put them on recently.
Gilded gold.
Oh, that's what I hear about Boston.
Yeah. But I think we have that as kids and we lose that. Why? How come? Why do they do that? How come this is like this? And I think it's important to not train ourselves, but to create habits where we get that curiosity back. Yeah. And walking, I think, is one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah.
And I think it's important. You mentioned how people, didn't notice those bats. Part of it, I think, is because you're always walking by it and it's just kind of a background thing you've always seen. But I wonder in the last 15 years or so, how much of it is I'm looking at my phone.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm guilty of that too.
I'm not focused on my surroundings per se. And one thing I do is, unless I'm expecting a call or something, I'll sometimes put it on airplane mode.
Yeah.
That way I'm only using it to take pics.
I'm totally guilty. Like I even yesterday, I was really engrossed in a podcast series called The History of the 90s. And I'm just like, this is so cool because, it's formative years for me. Right. So I'm walking along listening to it and I got to the jungle and I'm about to go on it was my first hike yesterday into the actual jungle. And I made a little YouTube video about it just because I'd learned a mode on my phone to make it look smoother with the video. Shoot at 60 frames instead of 30 frames a second. Looks so much better. But as I got to the jungle, I'm about to hit the path and I'm still listening to that podcast. And I stopped. I'm like, Kevin, what are you doing? I took my earbuds out, put them away in my pocket. No, man, you got to listen. And of course, I get in there. It's just a symphony of noises I've never heard before, right?
I bet.
And then there's nothing more shocking and frightening than when there's monkeys up above jumping because they're crashing from tree to tree. And sometimes the tree branches break off and fall. And then you'll hear them screaming and stuff. And that's utterly terrifying. A few moments you're just like, sure. And you look up and you realize, oh, it's monkeys. Okay.
Yeah.
You think there's like a Sasquatch coming to rip you apart or something.
You never know.
You never know. True. You do never know with those guys. So you've done that 88 temples. You've done a lot of other impressive walking adventures. You've done some really great hikes. And what I'm wondering, do you have on your bucket list, or do you have a bucket list, first of all? But are there other walks that you would like to do? And I just threw an example your way of the old Tokaido or any of these kind of famous places in Japan. Are there any that you're maybe in the future, in the next few years, might be a place you're exploring?
Well, I wouldn't say I have a bucket list. I actually don't like the idea of a bucket list. Now, of course, there's places I want to go, but there's two things. I don't like this idea that I must do this before I die. That's what a bucket list is.
Yeah.
Why pressure yourself? If you get there, you get there. And the second reason is you might very much find that you get there and it's not as good.
You're disappointed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, bringing it back to walking, a lot of times it's the part in between the places that are the most interesting, the interactions with people, the random things you see.
Yeah.
But in terms of the immediate future, locally, about a year ago, I found out about, I believe it's a national park or a national something or other, the Sanin Kaigan.
Okay.
It's a bunch of separated sites along the coast of Tottori Prefecture and I believe Hyogo Prefecture. And I think some of them do involve hiking. Some might just be, check out this lighthouse. Look at this cool rock in the ocean. Yeah. But I thought to myself, they're not necessarily from start to finish. They're not that far apart. I could probably walk between them in 5 days. So that's probably maybe by the end of the year, if not January, February.
Okay.
And then I was considering up until about a month ago about making another attempt of through hiking the Appalachian Trail next year. I got permission from the wife. Everything looked good to go. But I don't think it's the right time to make a 4 to 6 month commitment.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not, the timing's not right. So instead, what I'm thinking, I don't know if you've heard the Michinoku Coastal Trail.
No,
in Tohoku.
Okay.
I don't know the exact details, like the length. I think it's on average supposed to take about 2 months. There's probably a lot of road walking, but especially I think as you get up north, some beautiful natural scenery.
Oh yeah, in Tohoku. I've never been there. That would be amazing.
Yeah, and neither have I. And you can camp a lot of days, but the options there as well if you want to stay in accommodations. So in a sense, it's probably a more natural, or it's probably similar to the 88 Temple pilgrimage, but with a lot more hiking, natural settings.
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool.
So moving forward, those would be the two.
I think once I get settled in here, walking, I think that's, I need to kind of, figure out what kind of walking adventures I'd like to go on, because that's the thing too. I think I'm a walker, and I do enjoy hiking sometimes, depending on, I don't like the real rough, hairy, scrambling, climbing. I don't like heights.
No, I hear you.
I am now in a tropical zone, so I got to admit, like yesterday, it was pretty fun. I got like everything. Like when I hit the trail, it was sunny, and then I got up. I was hiking along. It was really interesting. I'd get into these like under the canopy in certain kind of hollows, and all of a sudden, it was almost like I needed a headlamp. And this is in the morning.
Wow, the density!
The density was impressive.
That's crazy. And what time was this about?
Like I was hiking between 9 o'clock in the morning and 12 in the afternoon. Yeah.
So okay, I was just curious. Was it like late in the day, early
morning?
No.
The canopy was so dense that it was like almost dark.
Yeah.
And then like a monsoon style rain came in and just dumped on me. And I prepared enough to bring a large Ziploc bag in my backpack, and I just quickly threw all my stuff, like my phone and my wallet and stuff in there. And then I just enjoyed it. I'm just like, this is hilarious. Like, of course, the jungle, and it's just pouring rain. And I, fell a few times coming down the mountain because, it's wet. But it was a fun experience. But, and I'm looking forward to, I'm going to do some more research into walks and get out walking. Yeah. Once we're settled in. I
mean, a lot of times for me, it's Google Maps. The first walk I just talked about, I was like, shouldn't somebody just connect these areas by walking along the road? Yeah. And then of course you can, how far is that? What would be the time between this place and this place? It's a good tool for the curious walker.
Oh yeah, it's great fun to just
other things
and to just sit at home and have a beverage and just sit in front of Google Maps and look at the different places. What if? Exactly, a lot of the what ifs. So Kevin, I don't want to keep you much longer. You're an hour ahead of me, and I'm hungry. Okay. I've got to go eat. Actually,
okay.
But if people do want to find you online and find those wonderful pictures, I was wondering if you could share where you are and where they can go and see those things.
Please send a self-addressed stamped envelope. Remember that back in the day when you had to get some information?
True. And
when
then
did that stop?
And you'll mail photos to them.
Yeah.
They do have to pay for the processing fee.
Yeah, they need the stamp. No.
But you also have to bring them to the photo lab and get them printed out, the photos.
That's true. Okay, so they have to put money in no. Instagram would probably be the best way.
Yeah.
And my handle is The Green Hoof. TheGreenHoof.
Nice.
Green Hoof.
The Green Hoof. Cool. So, folks, that will be in the show notes. That'll also be in the Facebook group. Go check out The Green Hoof on Instagram to find out what Kevin's up to and just to see all the beautiful photos he's taken. And you can kind of scroll back in his timeline and see photos from that 88 Temples walk and the different places he's gone to. And it's definitely worth a follow. So go do that, folks. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here, and hope it certainly, I am having trouble talking. I hope it won't be the last time.
Neither do I. I think you are ready for dinner.
Yeah. And I want to give a big shout out to Kevin. Thank you, Kevin, so much for taking the time to come on yet another episode of one of my podcasts. Kevin was on a really early episode of the Just Japan podcast. And also, if you guys don't already know, and I hope you do know, you should know about the Supernatural Japan podcast. That's my other Japan podcast that comes out a few times a month, all about the spookier side of Japan and then kind of mystical side of things, and just folklore-ish. There's a lot of folklore. So the Supernatural Japan podcast talks about like mysterious and folklore. I love folklore. I've always loved folklore. Growing up in Nova Scotia, Canada, and I'm in O'Shea, I was always very fascinated with kind of the local Scottish folklore of the region and the Irish folklore. So that's always been something I've liked. And I love, obviously, Japanese folklore. So Kevin was on 2 different episodes of the Supernatural Japan podcast talking about that 88 temples pilgrimage. So you gotta listen to those episodes. I'll put links in the show notes as well. So thank you so much, Kevin. Go follow him on Instagram at The Green Hoof. That link will be below as well. Well, moving on. Let's see what's going on here. It's always hot here in Malaysia in the tropics. One thing we're battling with in the old O'Shea household now are something called, in Japanese, they call them yakedo mushi. And yakedo mushi are called rove beetles in English. But here in Malaysia, in Bahasa, they're called semut Charlie, which translates to Charlie ants. And they're these small ant-like insects that are multicolored. They're black and kind of an orange color, and they're quite small, and they're quite dangerous. So basically, if they bite you, you're going to get a really horrible reaction. If you squish them and get the juice on you, you will get an even worse reaction, a topical dermatitis that turns into these massive scarring blisters, and it takes about 2 weeks to heal. And they have been getting into our bedroom somehow, in our shower room. And I have a scar on my foot for one that got on my sock back in the fall. And I'm going to have the scar for life. It's about the size of a quarter. So they're pretty nasty. They get into people's bedrooms and stuff and get into people's beds, and people roll on them and have horrible experiences. So somehow, even though I live in a very modern apartment building, I do live on the side of a mountain. So there's tons of critters that are flying off the mountain towards our apartment at night when the lights are on. But we keep all of our windows sealed and all the doors closed, and we've got a special thing that we put like under the door. It kind of like a dual purpose thing to keep out air pollution, which we don't really have here, but it's something from kind of a hangover from our Beijing China days. We always have these things under the doors, but it keeps bugs from coming in the apartment too, which is the more crucial thing here. But these bloody things keep getting into the apartment, and as I'm recording this on Saturday morning, I have I've killed very carefully, I think 6 or 8 in the last 2 days, finding them in our bedroom. And what you do is you get a wad of tissue, fold it carefully, and you scoop it up in the tissue. And then the best way I found, and then you carefully drop it in the toilet and flush the toilet, because you don't want to squish it and you don't want to get that juice anywhere, because that juice it's worse than any bee or wasp sting you're going to get. And I've been stung. I was a beekeeper, guys. I was a beekeeper in China. Maybe that's something for another episode. But for a couple of years, I was doing the beekeeper thing, which was a very cool experience. But I've been stung by bees. I've been stung by wasps, hornets, and that hurts at first, but the pain goes away after a few hours or a day or two. These things, the pain lasts for literally a couple of weeks. So, Charlie ants, yakedo mushi. They are in Japan, but they're not very common. Do a Google search if you're curious what I'm talking about for rove beetles, R-O-V-E, beetles, and you'll see. If you really want to get grossed out, just do a search for rove beetle bite. Ugh. Okay. All right. So that's it for me, guys. I've already mentioned some of the social media links where we're hanging out a lot. Go check out the Patreon. Become a patron. I really appreciate it. Help support the shows. These shows cost money to produce. I don't use Anchor, like the Spotify service for this podcast or Supernatural Japan, because it's terrible. I used to use Anchor.fm, which is now Spotify for podcasters, which is a free service, and I use that for some podcasts, but it is not good. It's really not good. I've got a podcast about a geolocation game I play called Muncie, which is up there. And then the podcast that I do with my son, who knew World War II, we have that up on Spotify for podcasters. But it's quite a painful service, and the analytics aren't accurate, and it's just not good. So this has been on a paid service called Libsyn since the very beginning, and I've continued paying a monthly fee for all those years. Even when the show was dormant, when I wasn't recording the Just Japan podcast, just so I could keep the feed alive for you guys. And the Supernatural Japan podcast, I'm using Buzzsprout for that one. So I'm using Buzzsprout and Libsyn. They're both good in different ways. I do like them both, which is really interesting. But that's for another topic. Maybe I'll do an episode of the Spicy Wasabi podcast over on Patreon about podcasting. That could be something cool to talk about. I'm going to get my son on to talk about language acquisition and stuff too for an episode. And I've got Brian in Fukuoka, My 2 Yen, over on Twitter. He's going to be coming over for an episode very soon of the Spicy Wasabi podcast. These are the ones that are in the Patreon only feed. So if you become a patron, there's a bunch of podcasts. You'll hear from all kinds of cool people who are in Japan doing neat stuff, and these kind of episodes over there. Oh, it's cool. It's cool. It's going to be more cool. All right, guys. Well, that's it for me. Go follow me on all the socials. All the links will be below. On Instagram at Japan Night Scenes, which I've brought back. There's a lot of stuff focusing on Japanese toys, which I collect, and also just night photography. Go follow me on Twitter at MadForMaple, X Twitter. I'm still active over there. At MadForMaple. There's still a bit of a Gaijin Twitter community hanging on in there, and I'm part of that, and I love interacting with them. And and then of course over on Facebook at Just Japan Stuff. Come over to justjapanstuff.com and check out that too. All right, folks, well, that does it for another episode of the podcast. Please show your support. Give us a rating. Give us a review wherever you listen to us. If you can, become a patron. And of course, tell someone you know about this podcast. Help us grow. Tell a friend about it. That will help us. And that's it. So I will be talking to you all next week. So until then, take care. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy, hope you're healthy. And I will be talking to you very, very soon.